I figured if I waited for Patricia O'Toole to greet all her friends and admirers, we would be here for a long time. I'm Harold Holzer. Welcome to Roosevelt House. On behalf of Jennifer Rabb, the president of Hunter College, I want to welcome you and commend you all for braving the weather and joining us for this event. I want to acknowledge the great historian Blanche Wiesen-Cook, who's here, to make sure Eleanor is mentioned somewhere. And Chancellor J.B. Milliken, what an honor to have you. Our many regulars will know that tonight's conversation will be followed by an audience Q&A, for which we will ask you to wait for microphones to come around so we can record your inquiries for YouTube, and before which, meaning now, I want to remind everyone to please silence any device that may make a noise, because inevitably they do, so this is the fair warning. And after the program, everyone is invited to join us upstairs in the Four Freedoms room for a reception and for an opportunity, practically a mandate, to get a signed book from Patricia O'Toole. So with that out of the way, we're delighted to welcome Patricia O'Toole and her brilliant interlocutor, David Nasaw. I couldn't help thinking as we prepared for tonight's event that Franklin D. Roosevelt, whose home we're in, of course, only ever had two bosses in 20 years of federal service, the people of the United States as president and Woodrow Wilson as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So that's the circle that knots us together. Of course, when Sarah Delano Roosevelt built this house for her son and new daughter-in-law, Theodore Roosevelt, who had given the bride away a few blocks uptown, was the President of the United States. And it was quite the big deal. It took place on St. Patrick's Day in another mother and son mansion near the Metropolitan Museum. It may not have been the Prince Harry, Meghan Markle wedding, but it was a big deal in New York. Traffic was stopped. Maybe it was for the St. Patrick's Day parade, but traffic was stopped on Fifth Avenue, and it was big news. But in 1912, when Teddy attempted a comeback as a third-party candidate, FDR ignored those family connections and supported the subject of our evening tonight, Democrat Woodrow Wilson. And then a year later, FDR and Eleanor rented this house to Thomas Lamont. Probably you'll recognize that name from the Lamont wing at the Metropolitan Museum. And they moved on to Washington, where he began to serve in the Wilson administration. Now, that's not the lead story of Patricia O'Toole's brilliant book, The Moralist, but it's a strain worth remembering as we welcome her to Franklin Roosevelt's house for this session. No doubt FDR remembered Woodrow Wilson's pioneering efforts to advocate for a progressive agenda when he used this house also as a transition headquarters after his election to the presidency, and perhaps his pioneering efforts to secure permanent world peace when Eleanor fought to create the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whose 70th anniversary we will be marking later this calendar year. So there are two indelible Wilsonian legacies that are represented in this house. The Moralist tells the story of a president often cast as a tragic, sometimes almost an impotent figure, but who in Patricia O'Toole's hands comes roaring back in a new light as a crusader for domestic reforms and world peace, a savvy politician, a strong public speaker, attributes often forgotten in the kind of miasma of the prevailing Wilson image as a sort of a unrealistic intellectual, and of course a hobbled stroke victim, unable to function in the last months of his life. For those of you who think only about Woodrow Wilson in these traditional ways, this book will prove a revelation. Not that it spares him his failures, including his backward steps on racial justice. Patricia O'Toole gives us a truly balanced portrait, severely critical of his character and policies when appropriate, as one reviewer pointed out, praising his idealism and persistence when appropriate as well. And all the critics have been lavish in their praise. The Wall Street Journal hailed The Moralist as scrupulously balanced and elegantly crafted. All of Patty's books are elegantly crafted. And the New York Times called it lucid, elegant, and exemplary. I can see the paperback now with the blurbs. Patty is a former professor in the School of the Arts at Columbia, where we met some years ago when at the Susan Hertog Biography Fellowship Program. Eventually, we began sharing an editor, too, at Simon & Schuster. She's the author of 4 previous acclaimed books of history, including When Trumpets Call, Theodore Roosevelt After the White House, and The Five of Hearts, an intimate portrait of Henry Adams and his friends, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Joining her in conversation tonight is historian and biographer David Nasaw, winner of the New York Historical Society American History Book Prize and the Bancroft Prize, who serves as the Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Professor of History at the CUNY Graduate Center. He's written on many subjects, including, I'd forgotten this until I looked again, the history of public education and of working children in early New York, and of the rise and fall of public amusements. I'm particularly interested in the fall, but we'll find out about that later. We know him best for his 3 monumental biographies, The Chief, The Life of William Randolph Hearst, Andrew Carnegie, and The Patriarch, his biography of the life and times of Joseph Kennedy. Is Denisha here, by the way, somewhere? Denisha didn't make it. I was going to give you 40th anniversary kudos because I know you're having your 40th in a couple of weeks. We know, when Denisha comes, we'll all celebrate upstairs with a glass of wine. David and his wonderful wife, former journalist for the New York Times and a filmmaker, are celebrating their 40th, unless she's left, but she'll be here later. So with that odd introduction, I give you Patty O'Toole and David Nasaw.
Thank you, Harold. Let me begin with one word: congratulations.
Thank you, David.
This is a wonderful book, So I hope you all have your wallets ready to buy 2 or 3 copies downstairs or upstairs. Upstairs.
No book reports if you buy more than 1 copy.
That's right. In Five of Hearts, which is a marvelous book, and I think I wrote you a fan letter, one of my only fan letters. And When Trumpets Call, you provide us with portraits of 4 remarkable men and 2 women. And there's a richness in their interior lives, especially of these 3 strange men in the Five of Hearts, and then Theodore Roosevelt. These are complicated men with complicated interior lives. What about Wilson? What's going on inside? And was it a tough transition from Adams and Hay and King and Roosevelt to Wilson?
Yes, both transitions were strange. I think I got Theodore Roosevelt wrong in the Five of Hearts because I saw him too much through their eyes, and he was a generation younger, and they thought of him as kind of a rambunctious twit. So I sort of regret that. But then going on to Roosevelt, my Roosevelt book is about after he was president, and what drew me to that subject was that he was only 50 when he left the White House, and this was a man who loved power, used it fairly well, quite well, in fact, as president. And I wondered what would happen to a man like that who loved power when he didn't have it anymore. So that's kind of the driving question of that book. That book was so much fun to write. Every morning when I woke up, I was glad that I could work another day on Theodore Roosevelt because you never knew what he was going to do. And sometimes it was wonderful, and sometimes it was exasperating. Sometimes he was shooting himself in the foot. Sometimes he was saying more than he ought to have said. But it was great fun, and I dreamed about him a lot when I was working on that book. Wilson took 11 years. Things I wasn't. What happened to my?
You're back.
Okay. And, you know, probably in no 11-year period of your life does everything go right. So there were mishaps along the way. But it was, I never dreamed about Woodrow Wilson. Not one little dream, not even a dream about some other character. And I don't dislike him. I feel sorry for him because he was a man of principle, deeply principled person who wanted to govern from principle, and yet he had one great skill, which was oratory. And let's say that to be a great president, you need to have 5 skills mastered pretty well. Maybe you're not A+ at all of them, but you go on and fill in the ones that you're not so great at and try to get up maybe to the A- level if you can. And Wilson never did that. He just thought he could do it all by oratory. And that became the source of his tragedy. He was very isolated as a president. He had to go to his room all the time and think. And, you know, we can think of other politicians that we wish would do a little more of that, perhaps. But isolation was a problem. And he's a very, very complicated person.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you you answered it a little, but I want more. I'm going to ask you the question that I hate being asked, and every biographer hates being asked. Did you ever get to like the man? You said you didn't dislike him. You felt sorry for him?
I feel sorry for him, yeah, which is a different thing from disliking him. You know, but he was a very hard. Ray Stannard Baker, who became his first major biographer, and knew him very well, first as a journalist, and then he was kind of the press secretary at the Paris Peace Conference. And in his diary, he says, "I do not love him, but I admire him." Yeah. And even Ray Stannard Baker couldn't love him. He just would not be loved by people outside his immediate circle.
But 3 women adored him, 2 of whom were his wives.
2 of whom were his wives. That's a very tantalizing way to put that for those of you who don't know the story, right? Yes, they did adore him.
Was he a different man with women?
Yes, there's one little thing he said one time when the house was full of. He had 3 daughters and then all these impecunious female relatives who were, you know, he's the only Wilson who made good. So everybody coming to Woodrow for handouts over the years. But one night, all the women were coming down to dinner, and he's standing at the bottom of the stairs in his formal way to meet them, and he said, "Oh, I am submerged in petticoats." And a little as if he's complaining, but he really did like being submerged in petticoats. I think it's, you know, women didn't give him any guff, really. Yeah. The other class of people that he liked were young men. They reminded him of his Princeton students. Franklin Roosevelt was one of them. They had some friction later on, but he could, you know, when the president, you're talking with the president, you're a young man, you're just starstruck to be there with him. And I'm getting a signal from my microphone. Oh, he's going to come down. Okay. So he liked being adored, and he did have his groupies, but he shied away from other powerful men, which, you know, you can see why someone might want to do that. He was on the shy side, but thank you. It's not maybe a very good quality in a president. You know, he doesn't like to mix it up with other powerful men.
He was a, you know, holds a special place for many of us because he was a historian.
Yes.
President. And he followed really another, you know, one remove historian president. Teddy Roosevelt wrote everything, but he also wrote history. Was Wilson possessed of a first-class mind? Was he? Was he a good scholar? Was he a good writer? Did he pursue original research? If he were not governor, then president of Princeton and the United States, would anybody read his books today?
The two books that I like the best are the ones that he wrote about government. One is called Congressional Government, and it was really a complaint about how everything is done in committee and then just rubber stamped by there's a lot of, it's 1885, I think, and there's a lot of contemporary resonance with that book. He doesn't like the committee thing because there's no oratory. It's all negotiation and horse trading, and he really doesn't like negotiation. He feels that a good political leader ought to, think things through, ask advice, look at a problem from every angle, come up with a solution, and then convince other people to accept the solution. And he thought that if you compromised, it was going to be, you'd come up with something that was less than this ideal solution that he had thought up. So those are strange qualities to bring to the office of the President of the United States. The other book is his book, Constitutional Government, which I think is 1907. Yeah. And there he has he's thinking about what the modern presidency could be. There'd been a lot of figurehead presidents, and he's seeing that the president is the only official who's elected by all the people, and what that could mean if a president took that, the powers of his office, and really ran with it. So those two books, they're both short, and they're both still worth reading if you care at all about civics.
We'll come back to his notion of the presidency, which I found astounding. Did you read his history of the...
of Division and Reunion?
Yeah.
That one? Yes, I did, and I found it rather turgid, and he wrote I think it was Harper's who paid him a lot of money to write a biography of George Washington, and it's just kind of a gloss on other...
Didn't he write a multi-volume history of the United States?
He contributed to a multi-volume history of the United States, yeah.
And wasn't kind to the immigrants.
Wasn't kind to the immigrants, although he changed his tune about that.
Did he?
Yes, and I actually wrote a little, sometimes I do these little historical footnotes pieces for the American Scholar, and when the DACA stuff first came up, I did one about a speech that he gave to a group of, he went to this ceremony in Philadelphia where these immigrants were becoming citizens, and he gave a speech in which he said, we need you because you have all our ideals fresh inside you, and things are not going to go the way you think they're going to go always. And we need you to remind us of what those ideals are. It's a beautiful, it's a beautiful speech.
I was, as an American historian, when we talk about the presidency, we talk about how Lincoln extends the powers of the presidency. And we talk about the Roosevelts, Teddy and Franklin, how they create the modern presidency. And Arthur Schlesinger, after extolling the big presidency when Kennedy is president, and a little bit with Johnson, writes the imperial presidency, in which he goes after Nixon for being an imperial president and others. But I had never, until I read this book, thought about Wilson as someone who tries desperately to transform American government and transform it radically. Let me read on page 69. You say, soon after the Democrats of the Northeast began their Wilson for President talk, it was for them a straight line from Princeton to the White House. Wilson advanced a view of the chief executive that would have startled his younger self. Quote, his office is anything he has the sagacity and force to make it. The president is at liberty, both in law and conscience. That's strange, isn't it? Law and conscience. To be as big a man as he can His capacity will set the limit. And if Congress be overborne by him, it will be because the president has the nation behind him and Congress has not. And then you say the president was the only official, citing his thought, the only official elected by all the people. And then you go back to Wilson's words, no other single force can withstand him. No combination of forces will easily overpower him. Now that reads to me like someone, who hasn't read the Constitution.
And this is from his book called Constitutional Government. Yes, yeah.
What's going on here?
Well, one thing that's going on is he's watching Theodore Roosevelt, extending the powers of the presidency, and he's very excited about that prospect. He's watching the United States take its place on the world stage and thinking, oh, goody, goody, foreign relations get assigned to the president. And he's thinking about issuing executive orders. He's thinking about expanding federal authority, which he sees as, he's a child of the Civil War. He's born in 1856, and people think of him as like a Southerner in so many ways, and that's not wrong. But from quite a young age, he was what they would call a nationalist, meaning a unionist. He thinks that he's not a part of the lost cause Southerners wanting to refight that battle. He thinks the United States is going to be strongest as a union, and he's all for that. Yeah. And so then he's thinking about the expansion of federal authority and all those big economic reforms, the creation of the Federal Reserve, the modern income tax, new antitrust law, and the Federal Trade Commission. All of those things greatly expanded federal authority.
Right, but the Federal Reserve Act sets up an institution that is removed from politics.
Yes. Yeah.
And there's a sense in which Wilson, the great Democrat, is not a great Democrat. He's a Democrat with a capital D. And I hadn't realized that until I read this book. I mean, in a very important way, it's a revisionist history of Wilson, because you highlight the ways in which, and maybe because, is it because he believes that he has truth, justice, morality behind him, and Congress can't possibly?
Yes.
That democracy is messy and corrupt by definition?
Well, he's not thinking messy and corrupt, but he was the first president to speak to Congress in person since John Adams, so more than 100 years has gone by. And he does it because he's a great speaker. And the pattern of his speeches to Congress is almost always the same. He goes there to ask for something, and he puts it first in moral terms, and then says, and it's going to be good for the country as well. It'll have material benefits for the country as well. So he's always beginning with his moral vision of whatever the change is. And with the Federal Reserve, the battle was about making sure that the bankers didn't control the Federal Reserve. So to remove it from politics but keep it under the government was a great win for him.
Okay, because he doesn't trust. I mean, he's a progressive, and he understands the power of money.
Yes.
The power.
Yeah. And basically, with these things that he did, it's kind of the end of the robber barons, right? Yeah. It's the end of laissez-faire.
Yeah. What's astounding is that he sets out to be the government, but he doesn't work very hard, does he?
Well, he had apparently enormous powers of concentration. Yeah. And once I learned this, I made a little sign that goes above my desk that says "undivided attention." It's probably easier to concentrate before there were iPhones, but he concentrated. He also had a lot of people doing stuff before it ever got to his desk, so that he was only dealing. I mean, he's a very good administrator. He did go out golfing almost every day.
Every day.
But he didn't go out for the afternoon. He went out for maybe an hour and a half. That was the only kind of exercise he enjoyed. So every day when the weather was nice. But the golf actually ties in with his isolation, because a president like Theodore Roosevelt, when he went out to play, he always had lots of other people with him. And Wilson just went out with his doctor, and sometimes with his doctor and his second wife. Never would invite Senator Nassau to join him, didn't want to talk business. And the White House usher's diary for his presidency, which shows the comings and goings from the White House, he is having breakfast, lunch, and dinner by himself or with his family 99% of the time. And that 99% is probably low. It's probably like 99.5%.
Yeah, you quote, I think you say a White House aide, maybe it was that usher. He says, apparently he is not in a working mood these days. He spends nearly all his time with Mrs. Wilson, it's the second Mrs. Wilson, reading, playing pool, or visiting. You say just 4 pages before that.
Is this when it's coming up on making the decision to go to war?
No,
Yeah.
It's in your chapter
Yeah.
decision.
Yeah.
You've also got him on March 7th. You say, Wilson did, and just enjoy the elegance of this prose with me as I read it. On March 7th, Wilson did what he had so often done when the world turned against him. He took to his bed, staying in the family quarters for 10 days. Cabinet meetings were postponed, correspondence piled up on his desk downstairs, appointments were canceled. A cold, said Dr. Grayson. He clung to Edith, and no one else was let in.
He did see a few people.
Yeah.
But this was the most agonizing decision that he ever made. I mean, this is a man who was a pacifist. You know, his Secretary of War was a pacifist. His Secretary of the Navy was a pacifist. And the last thing, and he saw the Civil War as a boy. In his father's church in Augusta, Georgia, the churchyard was sometimes a stockade for Union prisoners, and the church itself was sometimes a place where wounded Confederate soldiers were nursed by his mother and others. And then his family moves to Columbia, South Carolina, about 10 years after the war ends, and it's just a blackened wreck. It was the last city burned on General Sherman's march. So war is anathema to him, and yet he's at a point where he can't think of a way not to go to war.
Yeah.
And he's this hanging out by himself, playing pool, hanging out with Mrs. Wilson.
And playing golf every day.
And playing
Was
golf
he a
every
good
day.
golfer?
No, he wasn't a good golfer because he was blind in one eye. So that would complicate your game. Yes.
That would not make it
Yeah.
easy. He's, the standard, again, the standard textbook story of Woodrow Wilson, and the one all those moderates and someone on the left salute is the president who kept us out of war, that he struggled and struggled and struggled to keep us out of war. But in this book, you give me at least a different take on that. It becomes apparent, I don't know whether you intend to do this, but you give voice to those who think we've got to go to war. That eventually, especially Secretary of State Robert Lansing. And as one reads this book, you begin to think historians aren't supposed to do counterfactual history. We're only supposed to talk about what happened, not what might have happened or could have happened or should have happened. But when you read this, you think, what would the world look like if he had gone to war, if he had brought the country to war, after the Lusitania.
2 years earlier.
2 years
yes.
ago, or after the Zimmerman telegram. I mean, would the Bolsheviks have come to power? Would hundreds of thousands of innocent boys be slaughtered in Europe? You make the case that maybe his pacifism, instead of being a virtue, did us as a nation and the European nation certainly harm.
Well,
I'm pushing it.
yes. He did talk during this period about his problem. He said was to know when patience ceases to be a virtue, and because Germany had been sort of swatting away. So, like, how many insults can you take? Well, after the Lusitania, which shocked the world in the way that 9/11 shocked the world, there were 1,200 deaths on this luxury liner. Most of them Europeans, mostly English, but 128 Americans. Theodore Roosevelt was all for going to war right at that moment, and Wilson couldn't see it. He thought he wouldn't have the people behind him. So he waits. And then the casualties that came after that would be like 3 here, 6 there, 3 there. So if you weren't going to go to war over the Lusitania...
The casualties on the boat, American lives
submarine,
on the boat.
Submarine attacks that involved American casualties. It was just like a handful here and a handful there. So if you didn't go to the war, into war after the Lusitania, you had to like wait for something else big to happen, and the Zimmerman telegram was it. This was a German proposition to Mexico: if you help, if you will make war on the United States, Mexico, we will help you get back all the territory that you lost in the Mexican War. And by the way, get the Japanese to come and help you too. That was the point at which he broke relations, and then he still hoped that we wouldn't have to go to war, that we could somehow avoid it. But 2 months later, he can't get out of it. And Lansing, and Wilson never liked Lansing, but Lansing was actually the one who gave him the only rationale for war that he could stomach, which was the world must be made safe for democracy. In other words, we're not going to war because we want anything, any territory or wealth. We're going for this high, noble purpose.
But it's also clear, or it should have been clear to him, it was clear to Lansing, it was clear to just about everybody else, that eventually we would go to war. And you say that when he lets the American banks lend $500 million to the Allies, that's the end of American neutrality. And he knows that the British aren't going to stop trying to starve the Germans, and the Germans aren't going to try to retaliate by sinking British ships. And the British are going to keep going now, and the French, because they've got all this money from us. So what does he think is going to happen? Does he think he can just wait and wait and wait and wait until the...
He was hoping that the war would be fought to a draw.
And then they'd bring him in and he'd ride in on his white stallion and make peace.
Yeah. He really thought that, he saw the attrition on both sides and hoped that somebody would give up, but they kept fighting, thinking we have to win. And in the end, he thought it would be a terrible thing if Germany won the war because it was bent on world domination.
Yeah.
So and the Zimmerman telegram gave him the excuse. Now, somewhat later, Mr. Zimmerman, who authored the telegram, said, well, we didn't mean that. It's just a bluff. So there was all this question about whether the telegram was authentic, and the telegram was authentic, but it was just kind of a big, like, bluff sort of thing.
The drama in these chapters is incredible. I mean, it reads just, you're riveted. you know what's going to happen. Well, I knew what was. I think everybody knows what's going to happen, right? But nonetheless, you watch the twisting and the turning, and you see this man who you portray as stubborn, as a moralist in the best and the worst sense of the terms, struggling to figure this out, and not talking to anybody except the bizarre Colonel House and Edith, who's smart, I think, and gives him good advice. Talk to us about Colonel House. When Dick Cheney became the assistant president, we all complained, but he had been elected vice president. Earlier than that, we didn't know it at the time, but Bobby Kennedy became assistant president. Certainly after the Bay of Pigs, because Jack didn't trust anybody else. But he had been confirmed as Attorney General by the Senate. Colonel House takes on more responsibility than either of them. Talk to us about Colonel House and the relationship between Wilson and House.
Colonel House is a Southerner. He's a Texas Democrat. He's been active in Texas politics for a long time, and he was physically not a strong man. He'd had sunstroke. He was a very rich man. His father was a blockade runner during the Civil War and founded a lot of enterprises in Texas. So House, he decides he's going to educate himself and wait for a candidate to come along that he thinks is going to be a good Democratic candidate for president. And he passes up William Jennings Bryan, who is, runs for president 3 times and loses. A lot of people passed on William Jennings Bryan. One member of the press said about him, "I love every bone in his head." He was really wonderful, kind of evangelical speaker, but kind of couldn't stay on track. So House just waits, and along about 1911 or so, he meets Wilson and thinks this could be the guy. So he makes himself very useful to Wilson. He's just a private citizen, and when he's not very active in the campaign because he wasn't feeling well. But he was a big help in picking cabinet members. And then, flashing forward, he gets very interested in foreign affairs. So he's Wilson's kind of ambassador or Secretary of State without portfolio, running around Europe negotiating. And he's a great flatterer. And he thinks that, he's in good with everybody and everybody thinks he's wonderful. He doesn't realize ever that he's being flattered. And nobody can flatter you better than a British aristocrat. So he thinks, he says at one point, my life is greater than any romance novel. I'm the only one with all the strings and all the strands in my hand. I'm the only one who knows what's going on. And so he has a very grand idea of his role in the world. And he's loyal to Wilson up to a point. But then he gets, I think, so enamored of hanging around with Lord so-and-so that he begins, the English or the French will want something. And House will know that Wilson would not like that thing, but he's like, don't worry, I'll finesse this. And they eventually break up.
But there is a Secretary of State.
There is a Secretary of State.
And he just sits in a corner?
Yes, he just sits in a corner and writes memos. He tries to help. And I tried to redeem him a little bit because he gets, from liberal historians who love Wilson, Lansing is seen as disloyal because in certain conflicts that they had, Lansing spoke out, told the Senate what he really thought, told the press what he really thought, and that did not sit well with Wilson. But when you read, he was a very thoughtful guy, and he wrote these little confidential memoranda to himself when he was faced with a problem. It's just his way of thinking through any situation. And then when he's Wilson takes him to the Paris Peace Conference, but doesn't rely on him for anything. And he's writing these letters home to his childhood friends and telling them, this is terrible what's happening here. This is a guy who cannot negotiate. And here's what's going to happen. And the predictions that he makes are worth reading about because it played out kind of the way Lansing thought it would.
I mean, I was, as you can see, astounded by, he's not even a colonel, is he?
No, he's a Kentucky colonel kind of colonel, yeah. I don't mean chicken. I mean, that's an honorary title given to people who do favors, usually governors who, you do a favor for the governor and they name you a colonel. We have to move to a state like that. Yeah. We can all be colonels.
Just a couple of, final questions as we wrap up, and we're going to take your questions soon. Do we want a moralist as our president?
Well, now you're forcing me to give away the ending. What happens is he's really a man of principle and moral conviction up to, and he gets his way for 6 years because he has majorities in both houses of Congress. Then in the midterms of 1918, he loses that. Both the House and the Senate flip. And Wilson can't...
And you blame him for that.
Yes, he put out an APB to the American people saying, you have to vote Democratic because I'm going to have to go negotiate peace and it's going to be a big deal and I need the people behind me. And the Republicans were justifiably upset about this because they had supported all his war measures very loyally. And then he ignores the Republicans after this. He doesn't ask their advice about what he should do in Paris, and he doesn't take any prominent Republicans with him to Paris. So he sets up this great antagonism with them. And at that point, what had been like moral conviction that you could, you might disagree with him about something, but you could see that he's acting out of his principles as they apply to the facts that he has to work with. And after the midterm elections, it becomes like, I have the right idea and you disagree with me and my idea is morally superior to yours. So the morality becomes moral superiority and moral vanity. So that's what we have to watch out for. But
the last chapters are, again, tragic. This man, Wilson wants is to get his League of Nations covenant into the treaty, and he makes all sorts of compromises. He lets the French have this, the British have this, the Italians have that, because he wants that league. And he gets the league, but without the United States. And it is, it's a toothless, gumless tiger. Can't do anything. Was there any way that he could have gotten the league passed by the Senate, do you think? If he had been...
They offered him some points for compromise, and he refused them. He had made these big compromises in Europe. He didn't, give away everything. He managed to get the reparations. People later came to feel like the reparations figure was too high, but the French were asking for $200 billion, the British were asking for $100 billion, and he got it down to $31 billion. And so that was a big win. And also, there were just a number of other things that would take a long time to explain where he was able to get them to moderate their demands. He also prevailed over them not to have a trial for the Kaiser because he thought that would make a martyr out of the Kaiser and that the German people would rally around that. But so having compromised in Europe, he came home and he just did not want any compromise at home, even though at some point in all of this, both the British and the French sent signals to the United States that they could live with the kind of compromises that the Republicans had in mind. So it's a tragic, it is tragic.
And does Edith want him to compromise?
She asks him once in the middle of the toughest part of the negotiations. There's a senator, after Wilson, he has a big stroke on October 2nd, 1919, and the fight goes on until March of 1920, and he can't lead the fight anymore. So the leading Democrat, the ranking Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Hitchcock, is kind of his point man. And Hitchcock comes and he has a long conversation with Edith and explains to her why he needs to compromise. Nothing is going to happen unless he compromises. And Edith goes to ask him, and he looks at her very pitifully, and he said, "Are you going to desert me too?" You know, he just could not compromise. So it's very sad.
And at the end, he's pushed House away.
Yes.
He pushes Tumulty. Is that how you...
Tumulty.
Tumulty? Mm-hmm. Tell us just briefly, Tumulty had been with him from the beginning.
From when he was governor. He was his chief aide, and then he came to the White House as, they called him a secretary, but he'd be like the equivalent of a chief of staff. And it was actually Edith who didn't like Tumulty. Yeah. And Edith has a certain kind of reflex anti-Catholic prejudice. Wilson did not have that. He might have had it when he was younger, but he got over it. And when you have all these Catholic politicians you're dealing with and all these immigrants who can vote, it's amazing how quickly you get over your prejudices.
Okay.
Yeah.
They're just... I have another 1,000 questions, but I won't ask them, except for one. You don't excuse, but you explain the segregation of the civil service in Washington. I mean, in African American history, Wilson is, he's the demon. He takes the one city where there's a thriving middle class that's integrated into the workplace in Washington, or parts of the workplace. And during the Wilson administration, this integration is destroyed. And it is a setback for black families and for black progress that takes decades and decades and decades to overcome. Just on a real down note, let's end by
Yes. There's no doubt that he was a racist president, and I'm not sure that he would have done this segregation of the civil service on his own. I don't mean to excuse him by saying that, but what happened was, and it's important to understand this, he wanted this big expansion of federal authority with all these economic reforms and these new economic regulatory authorities, and the Southerners in Congress, both in the House and the Senate, looked at this, and they're seeing expansion of federal authority, and they're thinking down the road and thinking, okay, now it's the economy, but at some point, if he keeps going like this, the federal government will come after all the state laws that we have about segregation that preserve white supremacy. They were terrified of that. So they wanted a sign from him that he wasn't going to do that. And what they asked for was the segregation of the civil service. So he does this as an expedient to get these economic reforms passed. So here's the moralist who makes an immoral bargain. And what was interesting to me about it was that it made him physically ill. He had to go to bed after he would have these knockdown, drag-out fights with Northern liberals and with black leaders who came to talk to him about this. And I think it was, this is me guessing, he never said this, but he was someone who got sick from a lot of stress. And I think that he knew that on this issue, he did not have the moral high ground. And he couldn't think his way out of this. He needed the votes, and he knew it wasn't the right thing to do, but he wanted to do these reforms. So it's... that's what happened, and you're right. The important part of it is that this damage lasted for a long time. Yeah.
Questions? If you have a question, raise your hand. Wait for the mic to come. 1 minute. Here comes your mic. Yes, sir.
This segregationist made a very amazing appointment to the United States Supreme Court while he was the president. He appointed Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court. Could you tell us a little about that?
Yes, Brandeis had been instrumental in helping him make a coherent kind of campaign out of his economic ideas. Wilson had kind of a grab bag of ideas for ending, ending the heyday of the plutocrats. And Brandeis he'd written his book, Other People's Money, and about interlocking directorates and a small group of people controlling a lot of big banks and corporations. So he was always very grateful to Brandeis, and he offered him, I think, Secretary of Commerce when he became president, but Brandeis turned him down. So when he had a chance to name someone new to the Supreme Court, he thought of Brandeis. I haven't been. Maybe I was just talking about this with another person who knows Wilson very well the other day, actually a biographer of Brandeis, and the question of was Wilson anti-Semitic came up. And I never saw that, but I asked my friend, the Brandeis biographer, who was also a very important person in American Civil Liberties Union, she doesn't know of Wilson's anti-Semitism either, because sometimes if that prejudice is, racism and anti-Semitism, it coexists in the same person, but it didn't seem to with Wilson.
Okay.
Is this on?
Go.
Hi, David. Hi, Patty.
Hi, Jim.
Congratulations. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
You look good.
Thank you. You too.
The title of the book strikes me as fascinating in itself because it reproduces the older historiography that you're not there, of course, but the older historiography that says something like this, that Wilson made immoral bargains with the capitalists. When he dismantled the China Consortium, he was doing something moral. But when he went for the Fed, say, and it's something else was happening. So my question is, what is the relationship between the material and the moral, in your view, in Wilson? And that gets us to the question of the meaning of progressivism. Because as I read it, what he's doing is trying to reconstruct the market, not dispose of it and not destroy it, but reconstruct it.
Yeah.
So then, in that sense, Wilson thinks that capitalism embraces the highest possible morality so that its spread in the world is the spreading of the morality. Is that...
Yes, I think so. I think so, and okay. He's certainly not, as far along in his thinking about these things as like Germans and Scandinavians were about like moderating the effects of the like social safety net. That was not really on Wilson's agenda, and as for There was this thing that was supposed to happen. The United States, the House of Morgan, was supposed to be part of this consortium to lend China, which had just become a republic, a whole lot of money, and pulled out at the last minute. But the way I read that is the House of Morgan cleverly contrived to get out of the deal. Not that, but then it was cast as this great moral triumph. But there had been. Ron Chernow talks about this some in his Morgan book, and when you really get into the State Department papers and look at what's happening, the two guys from Morgan came and said, "Do you think it would be better if we got out of this deal?" And they didn't. They saw how many things were going to possibly go awry in this deal and wanted to get out of it. So Bryan cast it as a moral victory, but I think it was the people from the House of Morgan helping Bryan cast it.
Okay. Let's go over here.
Hi, so we've sort of explained the racism that has somewhat diminished Wilson's historical reputation. Now we got to deal with something else. which is the Palmer raids and the imprisonment of Debs, whom Harding pardoned and invited to the White House. How can we deal with that in terms of Wilson as a moralist?
Well, that is a huge black mark on his record, the suppression of free speech in World War I. There's no doubt about it. More people were prosecuted and went to prison than ever before. And those espionage and sedition laws are still on the books, right? Yeah. So we can just pray that certain people don't see that. Yeah. Don't read books, yeah. That and, he's very slow. In the end, he did support a constitutional amendment for women's suffrage, but he really dragged his feet on that a long time, too. And the Palmer raids, which were, just raids on people that you think might be an anarchist, it's a pretty unsavory chapter, and it happened on Wilson's watch. And he didn't really, he would, like, for the suppression of dissent, he would from time to time say to his attorney general or his postmaster general, look, I don't find these things, you want to pursue action against these people. I don't find what they're doing all that objectionable. But they would say, well, actually, Mr. President, we need to do this because ABC, and that would be the end of it. So he never pushed very hard on those things, to his discredit. Yes?
Yes, sir, right here. Here's the mic.
The Versailles Treaty was a total disaster because it laid the groundwork for World War II. There's no question about that, I don't think. But is Wilson primarily responsible for the failure of the Versailles Treaty and the reparations, for example, which my grandfather, J.B. Morgan, testified in Congress against the treaty because the reparations would inevitably bring more conflict at some point?
Yes. Well, Wilson, he was making this treaty with others, so I don't think you can blame him entirely. In the United States, we tend to do that. And there's a kind of interesting theory by a young Frenchman. It never got any attention for various reasons. His name was Etienne Mantoux, and he was an economics student in Paris. And he came up, he like maybe 10 years after Keynes's book, which basically predicted, basically said the treaty was a disaster and was going to cause World War II. Etienne Mantoux thought, let's go back to Keynes, see his predictions, see what has happened, see what hasn't happened. And he basically concluded that the treaty had not punished the Germans enough because they had been able to rearm and become a militarist power again. So it's an interesting, and poor Mantoux was killed in World War II. His father kind of tidied up his manuscript and it was published in 1946. Keynes died in 1946 as this great modern economist, hero of economics for many good reasons. And Mantoux is dead. He can't go around and try to put forward his theory, get it debated. But if I were working on a doctoral dissertation in economic history, this is the thing I would take up to try to sort out the difference between what Keynes's theory was and, we all believe it because his predictions came to pass. But what Mantoux is offering is another way to look at all the data that Keynes offered. So.
One other question. You get into the role of William C. Bullitt in the negotiations?
Just a little bit, yeah. Just a little bit, yeah.
One more, two more questions. This gentleman over here.
Hi, just two quick things. One, when I asked Siri to help me look up the meaning of the word expatriate, I got the joke. So, nevertheless, Patty. So the election of 1912, the three-way race, You state that he was going to win anyway if either one of those guys dropped out. And if you look online on like 538.com that everybody's been immersed with the last couple of years, you can see that. And he doesn't need that much to really just sweep through on the popular vote as well as 81% of the Electoral College he won. I just was wondering, is that something brand new from you, or the fact that he's going to win anyway?
I'm so glad you asked me about this, because I've put forward this idea in my Theodore Roosevelt book, and people keep on saying the other thing. You know, they keep on saying, what happened in 1912 is you have running Wilson for the Democrats, Taft as the incumbent for the Republicans. Theodore Roosevelt can't stand what's going on, so he has to create his own party and run. And then Debs, it was actually a four-way election. And it just seemed to me when I looked at the numbers that the important thing was that 77% of the American electorate voted against Taft. So even if Wilson, you know, people have said if Roosevelt hadn't run, Taft would have won. And I just can't see that, because I think that if Roosevelt hadn't been there, a lot of people who might have voted for Roosevelt would have voted for Wilson on the progressive notion. And Wilson would, I did the math, and Wilson would have needed only 1 in, I think, 3 of the votes that Theodore Roosevelt got in order to win. Yeah. Well, I feel like I've told the world something really important, and they keep not listening to me. What should I do?
Yeah. I think on that, thank you, Patty.
Thank you, David.
And
thank you.
The reception is, and we will see you all in the reception upstairs.